Quotation mark.
Exclamation, not exclamation, what is it?
Quotation mark.
Quotation mark. Yeah, so whether you noticed it, but there was a reason for that. So of course you will have noticed that we've changed the schedule slightly. So next week Paul Dennison will be giving his talk. So I don't know how many of you know Sarah, probably quite a lot of you, because she's run lots of courses at Green Street. And Sarah goes back to Manchester days and the Manchester University Buddhist Society. I wonder how many of you went to those sessions at the university, and it was quite a seminal place to join a meditation class. So that's where Sarah started in the 80s. So from there on it's rolled, and Sarah has a class now in Todmorden. And before that, she had one in Huddersfield, which is now taken by Deborah Rakes, and that's been going 15 years. So these outposts that we don't often hear about, in Hebden Bridge, I think, as well, with the Samatha is still going strong. So I'm going to pass over to Sarah now, who's got an intriguing title for her talk, as well as the 5 aggregates. So let's go over to Sarah and see what's in store. Thank you.
Thanks, Veronica. So the topic for today's talk is the 5 khandhas, which translates into 5 aggregates or heaps, if you like. And the reason I wanted to talk about the aggregates is I felt they were a little bit neglected in a way. Perhaps a teaching that maybe we slightly overlook or we don't look at that often, but I find actually quite helpful. And in some ways it's maybe not surprising that we don't look at them all that often, because they don't sound very exciting, do they? I think the word aggregates, for me, I don't know what it brings to mind for you, but it makes me think of like a pile of rubble in a builder's yard. So in comparison with things like enlightenment factors and jhana factors and pratmaviharas and so on, it maybe doesn't sound terribly appealing. So in a thinly veiled attempt to make it sound slightly more interesting, I thought I'd try and come up with a snappy title for the talk. And what actually sprang to mind when I was trying to think of one was this phrase, whatever people say I am, that's oh, I've forgotten what it is now. Whatever.
What I'm not.
That's what I'm not. Whatever people say I am, that's what I'm not. And I'm afraid this isn't a quotation from some meditation master or anything like that. As some of you might know, this is an album title. It's the title of an album by the Arctic Monkeys. But the reason it sprang to mind is because, to me, it had a relevance to the 5 aggregates. And the 5 aggregates, matter, feeling, perception, volition, consciousness, are what make up, if you like, the totality of our everyday human experience. And so for that reason, the aggregates are often seen as a teaching that's connected with our identity, with who we are. And because they're not just 5 aggregates, they're 5 aggregates of clinging, attachment, they're things that we tend to identify with, that we attach to. And so often this is also seen as a teaching that is connected with how, if you like, our sense of self gets constructed. But it's maybe more accurate to say that it's a teaching that explores our human experience, and it challenges our fixed views about things. So what we believe to be going on, perhaps, and what is actually going on in our experience, is there a difference? Is there a difference between our conventional view of ourselves and the world, so that's what people say we are, and perhaps what is really there? So that's one of the things I wanted to explore today. But I also wanted to look at the 5 aggregates from a slightly different angle, not just to do with identity. And the purpose of the Buddha's teaching is to teach freedom from suffering. And the Buddha said himself, I teach only one thing, I teach suffering and the freedom from suffering. That seems to me the essence of Dhamma, if you like. And so I also wanted to look at the aggregates in terms of exploring how understanding them can maybe give us more freedom from suffering, not just perhaps in the ultimate sense of becoming enlightened, but also in an everyday sense. You know, how can we reduce the suffering that we experience in everyday life? And it seems to me as well that another aspect of Dhamma that's very important to me is the fact that it's a very practical teaching, that the teachings of the Buddha are practical. There's something that we put into practice, that we do, that we explore, that we find out for ourselves. And in that sense, I wanted to look at the aggregates in terms of how we explore them, how we can practically work with them in order to find understanding, find happiness, and let go of suffering. So that's kind of the context, if you like. So as I said, aggregates or heaps, if you like, doesn't sound very exciting, but actually it's a really significant teaching, and it comes up quite early on, in fact, in the Buddha's teaching. In the very first discourse, the turning of the wheel of Dhamma, when the Buddha talks about the Four Noble Truths. And when the Buddha talks about the first noble truth of unsatisfactoriness, suffering, he concludes by saying that in actual fact, suffering is the five aggregates of clinging. So this is something quite interesting to look at. And not only that, but the second sort of major discourse of the Buddha, if you like, it's often called the fire sermon. This is also really all about the five aggregates. And in this particular teaching, he describes the aggregates as not only being dukkha, but they're also anicca, they're not permanent, and they're anatta, they're not a permanent self. I have to say the word anatta quite often seems to cause sort of mild panic in people sometimes when you describe it as not self. And I sometimes find a slightly more helpful way of looking at it is more the sense that things are connected, that nothing exists on its own in a total vacuum. Things are all connected to each other. And that's certainly the case with the five aggregates. So, it's clearly a significant teaching, and it's also linked very much obviously to the development of insight, the three signs, and there's also quite a lot of overlap with dependent origination. So you could even go so far as to say that the aggregates are almost like the building blocks of dependent origination, the building blocks of samsara. So before I go on to actually go into in some more depth about the aggregates themselves, I also just wanted to say something about the word clinging, because these are five aggregates of clinging, or attachment, if you like. And the Pali word for clinging, as I understand it, not being a Pali scholar myself, is upadana. And I believe this actually literally translates as fuel. So it's something that keeps a process going. It fuels it. That's what clinging or attachment is. So the aggregates are something that we're attached to, something that we want to keep going, something we identify with, something we get tangled up in, if you like. Perhaps another way of looking at clinging. And they're often things that we think of as being me or mine in some way. And I think clinging in itself is an interesting word, because it suggests something that the thing we're clinging to is in some way insubstantial. There's something about the word clinging that suggests almost a sort of a slight desperation there, that it's something that we know we should let go of, but we don't. So I think that's quite an interesting translation of upadana as clinging. So I'm going to go on to talk about what they actually are, and if you bear with me for a moment, I'm going to try and bring up a slide with a screen share. So let's see if this is going to work. Okay, bear with me.
We've got it up, Sarah.
I hope you can see this now. My laptop is...
I think you've gone to the...
gone too far. There we go. I hope everyone can see that okay, but I've put up a slide which lists the 5 khandhas, the 5 aggregates of clinging. So we have rupa, which translates as matter. It's all physical material, if you like, is rupa. So in terms of ourselves and our identity, that's the body. But it's also all other matter, all other physical rupa, physical matter. Vedana, which is feeling. Sanya, which is often translated as perception, but it's perhaps more the process of recognizing sensory objects, of labeling them, saying what they are, so knowing that a colour is blue or white or whatever. Sankara is an interesting one. I've translated this for the time being as volitional activities, which is one of the many translations you may come across, most of which I think a lot of people find quite mystifying. I certainly have for some time. So that's, I'm going to go into that in a bit more detail. And then finally, the 5th one is vijnana, consciousness. Just maybe worth pointing out, while they're all there together, that it's not actually a kind of linear sequence. But in actual fact, you could say that consciousness vijnana embraces them all, and that they're all kind of interdependent, rather like with the teaching on dependent origination. These arise dependent upon each other. And so without rupa, none of the others would arise. Without feeling, we probably wouldn't get involved in sankhara, the volitional activities, because most of what we wish to do or wish not to do is based on feeling, wanting to continue good feeling or let go of bad feeling. And similarly, perhaps without labeling, again, we wouldn't have a particular response to an object. So they're all interlinked, if you like. And in a sense, that's kind of what's meant, I guess, to some degree by the word anatta, things that interlink, they don't exist independently in a vacuum. And I kind of see this as really rather being like a house of cards. I don't know if when you were a kid, if you used to build these kind of towers with playing cards. And the way that that you would do it is that each card would lean on another card in order to support the whole structure. And this is rather like what the aggregates are. They all lean on each other in order to support the structure of our existence, if you like. Like a house of cards. If you take one away, then it tends to fall down as well, which is worth remembering. So I'm going to look at them individually now in a little bit more detail. So I'm going to move the slide along and look first of all at rupa, which is physical matter. Like, so we have earth, water, fire and air or wind, and these are all properties of matter, if you like. And according to the teaching of the Buddha, this is all there is in terms of physical matter. Everything, that's us, everything around us in the physical world, all physical matter, from the furthest stars out in the middle of the galaxy to a tiny blade of grass to our physical body, absolutely everything in the physical realm is made of these 4 things. And I'm going to just switch off the slide for a moment and just perhaps have a little look at this in our own experience. So if you like, if you'd like to try this, I'd like you just to pick up an object, any object that you might have lying around, doesn't matter what it is. I'm going to pick up my coffee cup just to demonstrate how the 4 elements are all present in all objects. So we don't get anything that's just water, just fire, just earth, just movement. They are all present. So in this coffee cup, and you can try this in your own object, whatever it might be, there is the property of earth. So that's the fact that this object here occupies space. It has the property of extension, if you like. It has a solidity to it. It has the earth element. It also has the property of water or cohesion. In my case, it's actually inside the mug because it has some coffee inside it, but it's also the mug itself. It's the property of cohesion that holds this structure together. It also has the fire element because it has a temperature, still feels quite warm. So your object will have a temperature as well, be hot or cold. And it also actually has the property of wind or air or movement. So there's also a lightness to the object. It's not completely dense. I suppose on a sort of molecular level, there is constant movement of particles going on. So it also has, if you like, the air element to it as well, the movement element. And it said that this is the case for absolutely everything. That all physical phenomena are made up of these 4 elements. And this is a very useful teaching, I find, in terms of increasing happiness and letting go of clinging. I think our physical body is something, obviously, that we very much identify with, that we cling to in various ways. And to actually see our own body as simply being, you know, a conglomerate of 4 elements is actually very, very helpful. We're going to do a practice a little bit later where we actually have a go at experiencing the elements within the body and then letting go of them. But it's actually very helpful to practice in this way, to be mindful of the 4 elements both within the body and outside of the body, because they're the same 4 elements. And in doing this, it actually helps to kind of loosen a little bit of the view perhaps that we have around self and what is not self as well. That in the physical realm, it's all 4 elements. And I think also our attachment to our ideas about the body perhaps can often cause a great deal of unnecessary suffering, which can perhaps be alleviated to some degree by just occasionally bringing to mind the fact that it's just these 4 elements. Our whole society in a way is almost built upon this attachment to the physical body and the need to maintain a particular look or something, or to have particular physical objects in our possession. There's a lot of and a lot of suffering can grow up around that. You know, we often have a view about the body that it's not good enough in some way, you know, and just to see it in that very simple way, just to see objects around us in that very simple way and experience them in terms of 4 elements can be quite a helpful thing to do. And I also wanted to give an example of how actually letting go of our view of the body can actually lead to full understanding. So there's a story about one of the disciples, followers of the Buddha, who became enlightened, and this was a woman called Nanda. And it said that Nanda was exceptionally beautiful and very preoccupied with her own physical appearance. And the Buddha saw something in her that was kind of ripe for understanding, if you like. And what he did, he created a visual image in front of Nanda of a woman who was even more beautiful than her. And then he caused this image, this apparition, to physically age in front of her eyes. And in seeing this process, Nanda realized impermanence. She saw the impermanence of the body, of the thing that she was clinging to, and she was able to attain enlightenment. So I think that's quite a quite a nice story in some ways, just demonstrating how we can actually see something within the ordinary that enables us to let go. So that's something to work with, just as a mindfulness practice, being aware of the elements within and without, And I find it quite useful to work with in the sitting practice sometimes as well, because also it's not just the gross physical matter that has the nature of the four elements, but subtle matter, if you like, the fine material realm, if you like, is also the four elements. And sometimes you can get a sense of this by linking the elements with the stages of the practice. So the earth element in the counting, water in the following, the fire element in the touching, and the air element in the settling. And it can give you a kind of sense of subtle elements and physicality as well on the fine material level. So if you want to play with that, it's quite interesting. Anyway, I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint onto the next of the khandhas, which is feeling. I can get this to move along. There we are. So feeling Vedana. And again, as an aggregate, this is really, really simple, just as in the way that all physical matter is something very, very simple and straightforward. So is also feeling. It's either pleasant, it's unpleasant, or it's not very strongly one or the other. And again, I find this teaching extremely helpful especially when there's a lot of unpleasant feeling arising, to simply see it as just that, that it's simply unpleasant feeling. Quite often we get very caught up in the story around feeling. So I'll just stop the share for a moment. It's very easy to get overwhelmed by feeling as well, especially if that feeling is difficult and unpleasant. And to bring to mind this very simple nature of feeling can be a way of letting go of some of that suffering, of not becoming overwhelmed by what we're experiencing. And had an experience actually earlier in the week where I had a lot of pain, a lot of unpleasant feeling in my hip, to the extent that there was no position I could go into that didn't hurt. And it actually was quite helpful just to see this as simply being unpleasant feeling, because what made the suffering worse was all the thinking that goes around with the feeling. So actually being able to distinguish between the two was quite helpful, because what really causes the suffering quite often is the catastrophic thinking that goes with it. Oh, I've really done myself some damage. I'll never be able to sit and practice again. Or won't be able to work. All this sort of, mental story that we concoct around a particular feeling is quite often what creates a lot of the suffering. But to simply just see the feeling in the feeling for what it is, as pleasant or unpleasant, can take quite a lot of the drama out of a situation, and actually make things quite simple and straightforward in a way. So from that point of view, it's helpful to not be overwhelmed by it. And it's also interesting that I think feeling can be quite a good guide to where we're at in terms of whether the mind is skillful or unskillful as well. That quite often, if there's a lot of unpleasant feeling, you can be fairly sure there's an unskillful state going on most of the time, and that's quite a good kind of handy guide to know maybe perhaps whether you need to change how you're using your attention, if you like, to adjust things a bit. And one of the interesting things about feeling is that it's one of the links on the chain of dependent origination. And in some way, it's kind of one of the weak links. It's somewhere perhaps you can interrupt the chain, the process. I'm just going to show a little picture of the dependent origination cycle briefly to show you where it is. So bear with me. If I can do this. So I don't know if you can see that okay. Flick it onwards. Okay, so if you can see at the bottom of the diagram that feeling arises due to contact and then leads to craving, attachment or clinging and all the rest of it. So that's where it is in the chain of dependent origination. And there's an opportunity there to prevent the feeling moving on into craving and clinging, because what normally happens is that when there is a pleasant feeling, then our impulse is to hang on to that, to crave it, to cling to it, to wish for it to continue. And similarly, an unpleasant feeling, we just want to get rid of it quick. And that's the kind of the karmic activity, if you like, that keeps the wheel turning when we respond to feeling in that way. So it's almost like there's a little window of opportunity there to simply be aware of the feeling without either trying to grab hold of it or push it away in some way. So it's quite an interesting one to look at from that point of view. So I'm going to move on to the next one of the aggregates, which is Sankhara. And oh, I've just got your message, Chris Hughes. Yes, I will. So I'm just going to share the screen again and move on to Sankhara, which is volitional activities. So let's find this on the slide. To go back one. Oh, hang on a sec. Let's try that again. Slight technical hitch, bear with me. Okay. Right, let's just flick this forward or backwards. Sorry about this. Can't quite get us in the right place. There we go. Right, Sankhara. So I've always been slightly mystified by this one because there's so many different interpretations of what Sankhara means, and I've thrown up a few of them there on the screen for you to have a look at. So we've got volitional activities, we've got fabrications, mental activities, mental formations, conditioned responses, impulses, thoughts, if you like, and mental habits. All of this stuff could all describe Sankhara. And for me, I found the easiest way to get my head around it was to think of it in terms of that it's how we respond to whatever is happening now, is Sankhara. And I thought maybe the easiest way to demonstrate this would be with a little example. So let's say somebody gives you a box of chocolates, okay? And how would we respond to that? Various ways that you could respond, either skillfully or unskillfully. And so if you like chocolate, then but you're also quite greedy, you might respond to that unskillfully and look for ways that you could squirrel away these chocolates without having to share them with anybody. Or if you responded quite skillfully to that, what you may respond to is perhaps not the chocolate itself, but the generosity of the person who's given it to you. And you may feel a sense of appreciative joy in their skillful action, or you may feel a strong sense of metta towards that person who has done something very kind and generous. Another skillful response, you may immediately have an impulse towards generosity and wish to share them with whoever's around you. Or again, it may be something quite unskillful and your immediate response might be to feel guilty and anxious because this person's given you a gift and you haven't given them anything. And you may start beating yourself up for what a terrible person you are because you've not given them a gift in return. So all these different ways we could respond to something that happens. And how we will respond will be conditioned by our mental habits, if you like. So if you're somebody who's in the habit of cultivating a lot of metta, Brahmaviharas, for example, or a lot of generosity, your immediate mental impulse and habit may be towards the skillful. Whereas if you're somebody who's perhaps acquired a habit of being quite mean and stingy, then perhaps your response will be immediately towards something more unskillful. So I guess how we respond is conditioned by what's gone before as well. So hence conditioned response, mental habit, and so on. And also quite often how we respond to what's happening with us is thought initially. Before we take any action, we respond with a thought about something. So again, and all of these things, these responses and fabrications are all thought, mental formations. It's all stuff going on in the mind. So I hope that maybe clarifies a little bit about Sankhara, because I've always found it slightly mystifying, but it's an interesting thing to look at because it's the place where karma happens as well. This is where we make conditions for the future. What we do now, how we respond now, will condition what happens in the future, if you like. So from that point of view, it's actually extremely helpful to look at how we habitually respond to situations. And if you can be mindful of your thoughts and responses in that way, it can be quite revealing, and it also gives us the capacity to change if what we see is perhaps not where we want to be. So if we see that we habitually respond to things, say with anxiety, or we habitually respond, you know, with greed or something, it might be that there's an opportunity there to see something and maybe slightly adjust how we respond in the future, which in turn will condition what happens in the future. So that's that one. And I'm going to move on now in just a moment to the final one of the five aggregates, which is consciousness. And before I do that, I just wanted to say a couple of things about it, because I think this is one where we particularly identify. We certainly identify with our body, we identify with our feelings, we think of them as being me and mine, get very caught up in them. We identify, what do you know, I've missed one out. How interesting is that? I've actually missed out sanya, which is perception. We're straight on to Sankhara. So I'll go back to sanya. And sanya is perception. It's often interpreted as, but I prefer to call it recognizing or labeling, if you like. And quite often this seems to happen very quickly and automatically, and we don't often get a chance to see the sort of mechanics of it, how it works. But it's simply when an object enters our sensory awareness and we give it a label, we identify it, we sort of say to ourselves what it is, if you like. You could also perhaps call it conceptualizing to some degree, I suppose. I had an interesting example of this the other day, and I was out walking in the woods, and there was a deer in the distance, and I didn't recognize it as a deer. And my partner who was with me said, "Oh, look, there's a deer over there." And I looked in that direction, and what I actually saw was a kind of a brown oblong, fuzzy brown oblong with a white fuzzy bit on the end of it. That's what I actually saw. And it wasn't until the label deer was placed onto that I saw it as a deer. It's very interesting to see the mechanics of how that works. This is happening all the time, you know, that we're actually, our labeling is kind of creating our reality for us in a way. And we don't often see it, but if you get those little moments and you can see it happening, it's very interesting. And I think for me, there's something quite interesting about the connection between labeling, sanya, and view. because it's almost like we have this very human tendency to want to pin everything down. You know, it's a bit like a butterfly collector wanting to stick a pin through a butterfly rather than just let it kind of fly free. And I suppose we're a bit like that in our perception, that we want to label everything and pin it all down and know what it is and know where we are and orient ourselves. But actually, if you can let go of that from time to time, it's very, very interesting. And you maybe see things in a slightly different way. This perhaps goes back to sort of being aware of Rupa at a very simple level. And quite often labeling is where we get caught up in views as well. We go, oh, it's just that. And it's almost like we lose the magic of things by going, it's just that. And I was at Green Street one time, and there was a beautiful, beautiful bird song outside my window. Absolutely just exquisite. And I killed it with labelling. Immediately the mind went, what's that? What kind of bird is it? I need to know what sort of bird that is. Didn't matter what kind of bird it was, but there's this tendency to want to label things, stick a label on it, and then have done with it, you know. So to actually to see that tendency, and you know, maybe just be able to be aware of things simply as they are without getting caught up in labeling and views about them, can be very, very useful. So I'll just move on to consciousness, having skipped around. I did say they weren't in any particular order. So, consciousness you could see as the aggregate that embraces all of the rest of them in a way. And it's perhaps something that we get quite muddled up about in many ways, because I suppose we maybe tend to think that there's a consciousness that's just kind of there all the time, and that things, you know, pop up in it, or float past it or something like that. And according to the Buddha's description of the aggregates, that's not really quite what happens. And in fact, consciousness arises and falls away incredibly fast. It's something that's constantly coming up and falling away and arising again with the senses. And it happens so fast we don't see the join. So we have a kind of sense that there's something continuous going on. It's a bit like, I don't know if when you were a kid you had those books where you've got a little picture on the corner of each page, and if you flick it really quickly it looks like a moving image, but in actual fact it's all these individual images. And it seems that that's how consciousness is a lot of the time, that we're having continual moments arising and falling, but we put them all together and it looks as if there's a continuum. So I'll just bring up the slide. So here we are, Vijnana, consciousness, and it's interesting that the word for consciousness here is not chitta, nor is it, I think the other word is mano or manos for mind. The word that's used in the aggregates is vijnana, which is the same word that's also used in dependent origination to describe consciousness as a link on the chain of dependent origination. And it seems, we had a bit of a discussion about this in last week's talk actually about Abhidhamma, that there seems to be a very fine distinction between these different words for mind or consciousness. But it does seem like the word vijnana, maybe Pali scholars might have more to say about this later on, seems to be connected with the consciousness that's connected with the senses, with sensory consciousness, if you like. So how it arises is that there is a sense base, so that's like the ear or the body or the eyes, and that sense base comes into contact with a sense object. So for example, the ear, the hearing base, comes into contact with a sound, and then a sound consciousness arises. So these consciousnesses arise actually out of the other four aggregates. They arise from the senses, if you like, from the rupa of the senses. And in the in Buddhism, of course, the mind is also considered to be a sense space, and its sense object is thoughts, its own thoughts, if you like, mental activity. So that's also counted as one of these consciousnesses. And of course, what happens in everyday life is that these consciousnesses arise and fall continually, very, very fast. So there'll be a hearing consciousness and a visual one, there may be a taste, maybe a smell, a thought, and we're moving between these all of the time so fast that we don't really notice the join, if you like, and it creates a sort of sense of a coherent reality, a continuum, but actually it's something arising and falling very fast all the time. And you have to kind of wonder at the genius of the mind of the Buddha, of how still the mind of a Buddha would be to see these infinitesimally small sort of movements happening, you know, continually, to be able to analyze that process. So in that sense, that consciousness is a process that's continually arising and then falling away. I saw a little cartoon actually on the internet the other day, and I'll just tell you what it said because I found it quite amusing. But it seemed to illustrate this this quality of consciousness as arising and falling, and it was an image of a meditation teacher with their class, and the teacher said, "Now, be aware, be present in this moment. No, this moment. No, this moment. No, this moment." That was the little cartoon. And so that's what is happening in sensory consciousness, a series of moments arising, falling, arising, falling. And again, it's very difficult to see things at this very, you know, fast level, but just to have a sense of that, again, it's a way of letting go of the clinging, of thinking, you know, this is my consciousness, my thoughts and so on. They're arising and falling all of the time. I think we maybe see it particularly with thoughts, you know, the mental sense and the mental objects. You know, they may seem terribly important at the time that they're happening, but if you try to remember exactly what thought was going through your mind, you know, at this time 3 weeks ago, you have no idea. Something arising and falling all of the time. So finally, I just wanted to have a little look at the chain of dependent origination, just to maybe give some sense of how these aggregates sort of fit within that, just briefly. So I'm going to go back to the screen share again. So here we go. So rupa, that's physical matter, appears under mind and matter here, and forms the basis for our 6 senses, obviously hearing and seeing and touch and taste and smell and so on. So that's rupa occurring there, and we have contact because of our senses, contact between the rupa within us and the rupa that's external to us, if you like. And here we have feeling, Vedana, which is either pleasant or unpleasant or not strongly either. And feeling is present all of the time. In the Abhidhamma, it's one of the universals. And it's also interesting that it's a mental quality. You know, it's all of these are mental apart from rupa. There's only one of the aggregates that's actually matter. The rest are all in the mind, feeling included. And that's what gets us stuck into clinging and craving, that we want. This is what we do, you know, most of the time when we're just in normal consciousness and maybe not particularly awake, that we are just driven by feeling of we want to carry on the good feeling and we want to remove bad feeling. You can see this even in the body. Just when we're sitting for any length of time, the body becomes uncomfortable. It makes little adjustments. We're constantly trying to re-establish the good or neutral feeling, let go of the painful. So there's feeling. And then sankhara, these volitional activities, what causes things to happen. It's kind of around here really. We've got craving and attachments and becoming happening in sankhara. We're responding to things, either pushing away or, you know, trying to hang on to, and that's creating future effects, if you like. Consciousness here. We've got mental formations here as well, but they're also here. So this is maybe the habits. Oops, lost it. Sorry about that, it disappeared. Let's try it again. So we've got the past mental habits, if you like, whether we're inclined towards being skillful or greedy or full of aversion, whatever, which then affect what happens in the present and how we make things happen in the future. And then consciousness here, and also with mind and matter, and our awareness of all of the rest of it is consciousness. So there's a connection between the aggregates and the chain of dependent origination. And ignorance, if you like, is us not seeing the three signs: the impermanence, the dukkha, and the fact that all things arise dependent on other things. They're not on their own. The fact that we don't see this means we keep on clinging to them. We keep giving fuel to the fire, if you like. So at that point, it might be quite nice just to do a little bit of practice together and have a go at actually letting go of something. Because in a sense, that is the antidote, if you like, to clinging and to ignorance, is to try and let go of things. And so there is a way, if you like, that you can get a taste of letting go of all of the sankhara, all of the aggregates, which is a rupa practice. But we haven't really got time to do a longer rupa practice today. So what we're going to do is just a shorter practice to do with letting go of the of rupa, of the four elements, if you like. So have a go at it and just see what happens. Start off just bringing the attention into the heart area. And just, if you can, allow there to be a good feeling present, a sense of warmth. Maybe imagine a smiley face in the heart area, if you like. Or just a sense of being open, relaxed. And the earth element, the yellow pile, from in front of you back into the body. Bring the earth element into the body. Be aware of the earth element within the body. Hair, teeth, bones, skin, muscle, the solid earth element within the body. Be aware of the contact with the ground, solid earth. The air element outside. We breathe in. The water element outside. And the warmth of the room that we're in, fire element outside. Be aware of the heart. And make a wish, may I be well and happy. As you breathe in and breathe out, may all be well and happy. The whole of the body, contact with the ground, the space around you. And then slowly finish the practice. So I'll finish in a minute and see if anyone has any questions, but I just wanted to end the talk with 2 quotations. This is a bit of a theme when we were doing the the email about quotations. So the first is something that Ajahn Karuniko said. Maybe some people in the Northwest in particular will know him because he's a frequent visitor to the Manchester Centre. He's the abbot, I think, at Chithurst at the moment. And he gave a talk a little while ago, and he just made this sort of passing comment just at the end of the evening, which kind of really stuck in my head. And he said, the more I let go, the happier I become. It seemed quite appropriate for letting go of clinging. And then, seeing as we started off with a rock album reference, I thought I'd finish with one as well. So this is a song lyric by a band from the 1960s called the 13th Floor Elevators. And I'm just going to quote a few lines from one of their songs, the song is called Slip Inside This House. And the lyric is, there is no season when you are grown. You are always risen from the seeds you've sown. There is no reason to rise alone. Live where your heart can be given, and your life starts to unfold in the ways you envision in this dream that's ages old.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Such a complex teaching and finding ways of making lots of sense of it. Thank you so much. So would you like to open up to questions and comments now? Okay. Thank you. I'll just put it on gallery view and scan the participants.
Very much, Sarah. I really enjoyed the talk. Being a rock chick myself, I really relate to the rock references. I love it. I'm always thinking of lyrics, you know, come to mind. And Rolling Stones, you know, you never get what you want, but you always get what you need.
And you can't get no satisfaction.
And I just wanted to say as well, the practice with the elements. I remember back in Manchester at the Samatha Centre, and you may have been there, because I was trying to think when it was. Paul Dennison came to the Samatha Centre, and it was, we kind of got the Samatha Centre in 1978. So it must have been around the early 80s that I remember him coming to the big hall there and doing that exact practice.
Yeah.
I don't know if you were there, Sarah.
No, I've actually done it before. I think it was with Greville, because he was my first teacher, but
Right.
we didn't do it like that, actually. We did it within the settling. So that's another way actually you can do it, is to go to the settling and then do the practice from there.
Yes.
But I find it kind of, if you're feeling fairly settled anyway, it works quite well just on its own. So
But Paul did it exactly. I mean, I think he said, I mean, it's a long time ago, but I think he said something about he'd learnt it in Thailand, you know, but he did it exactly as you did, you know, as a practice. But I also wanted to say, what can you say something about why the directions, you know, putting to the left, in front, to the right?
Right, yes, I don't actually know if there's a specific reason for that. It just seems to flow naturally in that direction. Maybe it's a sort of clockwise movement or something. I don't know if there's other people who've done it before might know better than me if there's a reason for that. I'm not certain. I know sometimes we place certain things in certain directions, like with the four kings and things, so there may be some reason for it. Does anyone know?
I think the colours might be significant. I thought that was what I noticed about it. You know, because we have gold, silver, blue, and white. And I think in the Visuddhimagga, in the description of, you can make up the elements as kasinas as well. And there's quite a bit of description on what they might be composed of, or how you might create them as a visual image. So there's a lot. There's a lot in there in the image.
Yes.
Isn't
Ian was waving then. I don't know if
Ian?
you know, Ian, why it is they're in that order.
Well, I don't know about the order in particular, but there is a simile that was given for actually doing that kind of practice with the elements, which actually gives this rather strange image of a butcher who's kind of chopped up a carcass, but the butcher is sitting at a crossroads and lays out the parts around at a crossroads. So I think there might be some connection with that sort of four directions and four elements. It's not laid out specifically like that, so I'm not sure about the order, whether the order's relevant. But just it popped to mind.
Ian?
Sorry?
Where was that reference from?
I've got a feeling that it's in the Satipatthana Sutta, actually. I think it's when they describe, you know, one of the ways of developing mindfulness of body is with the four elements, and that simile is used, which is rather that's a very powerful, sort of striking simile.
So, thank you. Roberta, are you ready now?
I hope so. Can you hear me? Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that I really like your discussion about sankharas, how we respond to what's happening now, because I've always had a bit of trouble kind of getting my head around the sankhara bit, and that seems to make much more sense to me than some of the other. There's images of ruts and things, cart ruts and things like that I've heard before, and that seems to bring something a bit fresh for me and really useful. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. There was a massive amount there. And my urge is, let's have a discussion or ongoing discussion about all sorts of things in there. There was just one thing I wanted to comment on, which is you talking about feeling, talking about unpleasant feeling or pleasant feeling being indicators of skillful or potential indicators of skillful or unskillful states of mind. And I find that there's a danger for me in that of then labeling. So, okay, so I'm already having a tough time and then I'm labeling it as unskillful on top of that. And of course, at some level, yes, it is unskillful, but not in a way that I have control of at that moment. Often, sometimes I may. And so I find it more helpful in terms of the way you were talking about the relationship between feeling and sanya, the labeling and the volition, to think of other ways of labeling it that I actually find more helpful at the time than the label unskillful.
Yes, I think you're right. I think there wasn't intended to be any kind of judgment on that, but that I simply find it just almost like a reminder that, oh, I can do something about this. So rather than it being a label or a judgment, oh, this is bad, I shouldn't be doing it, or anything like that, it's more just, oh, right, I'm doing this to myself. That means I can do something about it by, putting my attention elsewhere or something. So rather than it being a value judgment, I suppose. But I think it's only very rough anyway, as you say, because quite often there may be quite a lot of pleasant feeling with a greed state, which may not necessarily be terribly skillful. But it can just sometimes, for me, it's like an early warning sometimes if I'm about to go off on one that's going into a very unskillful and, for me, unhelpful direction. It's like a little warning, like going, oh, hang on, can we stop this before it gets completely out of hand?
Yeah, I agree with all that. And particularly it's very helpful to remember that it's coming from me, as it were. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks very much to Sarah. I found that a really helpful talk. First question, I wonder whether the word bundle might be considered as well as aggregate or heap as a possible translation. And third, I took what you said about pain, and I think I try and do that when I've got pain, but I have much more difficulty when it's extreme tiredness, because there are no specific thoughts around it. Now, I don't know if anybody has any comments or thoughts on that one. It's a difficulty for me.
It isn't a remedy, Tony, but it's sort of linked to what you were saying. That at the beginning, when Sarah was talking about Rupa, I was reminded of something that I had forgotten. And it was a friend of mine who was associated with Samatha, but she was a very strong yoga teacher, advanced, and she had terminal cancer. And so quite a few of us were with her in the final few months. And one thing that she helped her, or so she said strongly, was that she had a kind of mantra, which was, I am not my body. I'm not my body. And I saw her, if you like, in the situation where, that gave us some way through certain stages. I'm not saying it was the answer. It was very remarkable in some ways, but it did relate in a way to what you were saying. But in those extreme circumstances, we're putting it into action. I'm still intrigued as to how effective that might be and how good it is, for one to do that. But just offer that as a recollection. Thank you.
I was wondering, Tony, whether you were thinking of it as tiredness of the body or of the mind.
Both, I think, yes.
There is something that's quite interesting, because they're often interlinked. I don't know if you've had this experience where you do quite a lot of exercise and then you come home and you feel quite sleepy, you sit down and you want to have a nap. So there is something you can do, which is to kind of separate or to try to separate the tiredness of the body from the tiredness of the mind.
Mm-hmm.
That's almost, you let the sort of tiredness sink into the body, but you try and keep the mind bright.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which is quite interesting.
That sounds odd.
You kind of feel it almost, you kind of feel it on the ground, like the tiredness, but your mind can still be quite bright and alert.
Fine. I often get very physically and mentally exhausted if I've done maybe a lot of physical activity or something. But then I find that somehow doing something with my attention, shifting my attention somewhere, can make a difference to that, which doesn't sound like very much, but sometimes it can make quite a big difference. So just to get up from wherever I am and move somewhere else, it's sometimes, not always I guess, but sometimes it just shifts something. We've got kind of stuck in that sort of body-mind loop, but may not always work, but sometimes.
Sanya question, Sarah. I was very struck when we looked at the wheel of dependent origination. You can pick out the other khandhas on the wheel, and you did. And Sanya was missing again. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about where Sanya is on the dependent origination.
Quite interesting. A sort of Freudian slip. I forgot about Sanya. I wonder why that is. It's
I know,
something I need
well,
to look at there, I think.
Yeah, so it's interesting that it had gone again. So I was just kind of wondering, you know, and it isn't obviously there. So
no, I suppose. Yeah, the thing I thought of was this name and form, isn't there? So I wondered if it came under that actually when we actually give a name to something, that it sort of almost takes form, you know, from that. Yeah, I think it's such an interesting area because it seems so important to how we construct our perception, that so much of this it's what we're actually doing in the mind as a result of sort of past experience that we're then bringing to bear to put a label on something that we see now, which maybe means that quite often we don't see things clearly because we're carrying all this weight of previous conditioning. And so it seems to have that kind of, it's both maybe a sense of something that we're doing now, but it's also almost something automatic that's carried over from the past, from our store of previous experience. So it seems to, I guess if you looked at dependent origination as this, the way the diagram I found was to do with past and present and future and so on, that it seems to be something that goes from the past into the present experience, but it seems on the wheel diagram that it comes under present effects of name and form. I don't know where, it doesn't seem to obviously pop up anywhere else, does it?
Yeah, that says about the name and form, and Sanya is part of the name, Dhamma, isn't it? So you sort of mentioned it already, haven't you, Sarah? But also Ian's question, and you know, when I've looked at the similar kind of thing, that the four are obviously stated in the cycle, and yet Sanya isn't. And I've often wondered, is it because part of the meditation on dependent origination would be to purify our Sanya, our perception, because as you sort of said, and I've thought the same, that, you know, the Sanyas are things that make our views. So the point of doing that practice would be to purify, get right view, you know, purify our perception of how cause and effect happens and things happen, so that Sanya itself is the practice of that process. Do you know what I mean?
Do you think we can choose which percept? Is there a choice there? So it could have been or it could have been something else. Sort of thing.
What I mean is, I think from having practiced dependent origination as a practice, that
part of doing that might be to purify our sanya, our perception of how the world exists or comes into being and goes. So in some ways, when Ian asked the question, I got reminded that when I was thinking about this a while ago, that to me it seemed like doing of the practice, the 4 khandhas are coming and going, and in the process, the 5th one is getting purified. So that right view, our perception of the world changes to right view. Because one of the things that perception seems to do is how we make a view of the world, I think. And I think you said that, didn't you, Sarah, that it might be how our views, not this, not that, how we might make our views. So sanya itself might be how we view the world, and dependent origination is to help us to unlock that view and, with our perceptions of how we might make the view. It would be unlocking that view. So it's a perception, perhaps a practice about purifying sanya, but you may not.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I've heard different interpretations of sanya, that it could be seen as simply the kind of automatic labeling of colours and shapes and objects, but it's also can be seen as a whole range of views, the way that we form views about other people and ourselves and so on as well, by labeling and conceptualizing. So it could cover quite a range, really.
Yeah.
I was just wondering in just relation to the dependent origination with, you know, the 3 time periods, that whether it's stretching it too much to say the relative importance of the aggregates, you know, at different times, from different times. So in the past, you've got the volitional activities, which are sankharas, aren't they, and consciousness. So somehow those are particularly significant from the past. And in the present, you've got all of them. In fact, you could say you've got feeling twice, because if it comes up in with nama rupa, and also feelings there. So feelings very, you know, particularly important, but sanya's there as well. And then in the future, feelings there with dukkha. I don't know whether I can quite remember if any of the others are kind of obviously apparent in the future, but it might be. You can certainly see that sanya might be most important in the present and not so important in relation to the past and future. You know, just another way of kind of trying to make sense of it, I suppose.
I was just going to say thank you, Sarah, for clarifying the, well, consciousness, really, in terms of like reality, when you actually, it's difficult to trying to say what I'm trying to say, but it's like frames in picture. Reality isn't a constant stream, it's a sequence of like stills. Thank you anyway.
Thank you, Robert.
I just thinking back to that previous point, I was just wondering whether you could also say that sanya belongs not as a stage in itself, but as a link between following on from feeling, because in a sense it's I mean with all of these things it says X conditions Y, so feeling conditions, etc., contact conditions. So the question is, how does that conditioning actually work? And in a way, sanya seems to be at the heart of all of that, because it's how you respond to that feeling, to that impetus. And so maybe it belongs actually in between, in the gap, in the connection from feeling onwards after that, rather than in the stage itself.
Yeah, I have to admit, when I was looking at it, it was very hard sometimes to distinguish between where sanya ended and volitional activities began, if you like. They seem to be very closely linked. And I mean, maybe what's actually happening in reality is that the mind's going very quickly between them, perhaps. So that would make sense in terms of being like a link between feeling and volitional activity. It certainly seemed very hard to see where one ended and another one started.
Yeah, thank you.
As part of the teaching of the Buddha is about how we develop a sense of self, and as you said, it's often related to the five khandhas. And what it seems to say, in a sense, is that we separate one from the other four. And I was wondering quite how that worked in practice. I mean, in a sense, that sort of sense of self is that you identify and you take on board. So there's something almost kind of, you're kind of taking on board something, even for a moment. And it occurred to me, I mean, for instance, when somebody kind of bangs into us and we're kind of slightly affronted, if you like, they banged into my body. Or if somebody says something that's slightly hurtful, we suddenly think, well, that's my feelings have been hurt. Or somebody comes up with a kind of idea or view which is perhaps contrary to what we were thinking. That's sort of against my view, that's against my labeling. And it's that sort of sense of meanness that comes with it, or we have a good idea, and that's kind of my idea. And that way that we kind of momentarily identify with each of them in creating our kind of sense of self. So,
yes. I think if I might, I would endorse that the thing that I've learnt most or got insight through the aggregates or whatever I've heard and heard again really brought to life is about one self-identity, really, and how you can get into a trap very easily about making these assumptions about oneself, and it makes you see that process, how you cling to appearance and views, and it matters so much. Sometimes it's very hard to distance oneself. I remember a phrase when I got very upset at work about some event, and my boss, I suppose, said, "Don't take it personally." And I was released, from blame, guilt, stupidity, all the rest of it. And it's a bit like this teaching, because, when you take it on board and really go into depth with it and see what's causing the suffering at that time, and see that process, it really is quite liberating. And that's where the Dhamma really, can, it affects your everyday life in that way, but particularly about views of self, just as Francis said, they can be quite a trap. So thanks for reminding me of that, to continually apply it.
Yes, it's funny, those situations where you feel your identification has made it me. I was thinking about sanya it's in many ways it's something like a process that you can feel. The traditional image is that it's like our colour perception, that it's like we know something's blue or red or something. So I feel I basically agree with what everybody's said, and see sanya as almost like a function which can be very positive. So, when you're eating a cake or something and you can't quite identify the flavour, it's almost like you feel that from your mind work. Oh, that's caraway, that you can't quite identify it. And it seems to me that samatha discrimination is a way of knowing when a state is skillful or not. That link between feeling and craving, that we tend to think of sanya as being a negative kind of labeling that interferes, but it can sometimes just be a sort of a process that's going on whereby you know it's a skillful state, or that you know it's really very dodgy, as in Veronica's example. So for me, it's helpful to think of sanya as a function of the mind that we are using all the time, that can be very positive as well as negative. And dependent origination, I agree with the thing that it is a process of purifying that sanya. It's just studying it and doing this sort of discussion as a way of purifying that aspect of our processes.
I think that's a really useful point, actually, because if there wasn't that quality of sanya of recognition, we probably wouldn't recognise what was actually helpful and leading to freedom either, would we? So but it seems that with all of the aggregates, it's not the aggregates in a way that's in any way the problem, it's the clinging to them.
Yeah, yes, just to agree with you, Sarah, actually, that the Buddha says, doesn't he, that the person who's enlightened still has aggregates. The difference is they're not clinging to them anymore. Mm-hmm. So, because to function, to just be human, the aggregates are just neutral. They're neither skillful nor unskillful. And you're absolutely right, really, that is the clinging to them that what we, I think, are trying to do is how not to cling to them. The human being still keeps existing after enlightenment, but they don't make karma anymore because they're not clinging to whatever's going on, to any of those 5 aspects of life. It's beautiful, really, isn't it?
There's no me to defend anymore, no. So there's no need to take any unskillful action.
Exactly.
No video, but I have something to say. Can you hear me?
Hi, Talia.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
I just wanted to say that Julian Cope, in his book Head On, which is sort of autobiographical and mostly about taking lots of drugs, I'm afraid, he has bits of philosophy in it as well. And one thing that he says is that he realized for himself that was very important is kind of the opposite of what the Arctic monkeys are saying, which is however people see you, that's how you really are.
I think other people usually see us much more clearly than we see ourselves, that's for sure. And that brings to mind something Lance used to say, or said once, I think, about how whatever people might think they are, if they think they're very lazy, they're usually the opposite. Because we don't usually see ourselves very accurately.
Well, I wonder if that's a good point to end on, that we don't see ourselves very accurately. So just strive on. What is it?
Purifying the old sanya.
Okay, then. Well, I think we'll bring it to a close. And just a reminder about next week, it's Paul Dennison's talk next.